My name is Stephen Carpenter. Um, I do he, him, and I'm at Farmers Legal Action Group, which is a nonprofit law firm based in Minnesota. I'm actually, thanks to the ability to go remote, often in Missouri, but spent a long time in Minnesota too, and that is where Flag's based. Flag's a nonprofit law firm that works for family farmers. Um, Let's see, what else? Oh yeah, so we were super curious to know a little bit about whoever is on. So if you feel comfortable, if you have access, maybe put in chat your name and what you're up to and where you are would be fun to know. We're about to talk about farm law, and we've got an hour and a half. And the way that I'm kind of thinking about it here and open to suggestions or amendments is that I have a bit of an outline. It's 4+ pages long. I'm going to share that here in a minute. And basically, we're going to really rip through some farm law stuff, and and I would encourage you, if you have a question, to put it in the chat. Alexandria has agreed to kind of monitor that a little bit. And so we may, if you put your question in chat, she may break in and say, oh, we have a question. But actually, if you just want to interrupt me, that's cool too. If it seems like it might be a little bit too much of a diversion, we might put it off to the last. But I think it's completely okay to say, oh, hey, something you just said, I don't really, that's something seems off with that. What did you mean? Is I think a useful thing to do if you have those questions. Um, what else? I'll just say offhand, I'm going to say we're going to cover like 5 major topics, and there are things in each of those topics. We're going to talk, and some of it's going to feel simple in a way, but maybe is a little bit deceptively more complicated. So we're going to talk about contracts and how those affect farmers. We're going to talk about what lawyers would call debtor-creditor law, or what happens when you're a farmer and you owe somebody money or you borrow from them. We're going to talk about legal liability for farms, the main ways that that can arise, and about 2 different strategies. They're not mutually exclusive, about how people sort of think about those risks, those legal risks, and how to handle them. We're going to talk a little bit about legal entities like LLCs and the like. And we'll also talk about insurance and what role that could play in managing legal risk. We'll also, kind of briefly talk about the government regulation of agriculture, and we'll talk for a few minutes about discrimination in agriculture as an ongoing problem, whereby farmers are discriminated against. And what else? We'll talk super briefly about employment law. And I think one thing that we can say here is that there are a lot of other topics that we could cover. And if you feel like we're skipping something that you really, really want to hear a little bit about, go for it. Um, I used to read when I was a boy a column. It was actually in the Farm Journal magazine, and there was always a lawyer and would answer questions. It was just interesting as a kid to read. I remember one time the guy answered a question by saying, "Thank you for breaking the string of 2 straight months without a fence law question." Because everybody always wanted to know about fence law. So I don't know about fence law anywhere except for maybe Minnesota and Missouri. So if you have that kind of question, maybe we'll wait. But everything else, let's go for it. So I am going to try to share my screen. Um, Look at that. I think we succeeded, did we not? Yay. All right, so I'm just going to go through really fast and tell you again sort of where we're headed here. We sort of did our introduction. We're going to talk sort of about how to think about state law and the fact that we're going to be talking about the law that applies to a number of states, contracts, types of property. You wouldn't think that would be something we would talk about, but we are. Like, what is personal property? Then we're going to spend a fair bit of time talking about loans and how they work. Here you can see Roman numeral 6. We're going to talk about legal liability, some of the most common ways that you end up with liability, legal entities, how they kind of work in this question. There's Roman numeral 8, that's insurance. We will talk about, as I said, we're going to super briefly, oh, look at those typos. Yikes. Okay. So Roman numeral 9, we're going to talk about hiring employees, and we're going to ignore the spelling errors under A and anywhere else they occur. Um, and then we'll talk about discrimination and about government regulation. So back to the top. One of the things that's sort of important to remember here is that we have an audience of folks from all over. And there's a few of the things that we're going to talk about today that really are federal law. So they are true for kind of everybody in the US, even places off in general, like Puerto Rico, which under the jurisdiction of US law, especially for things like USDA. But a lot of things we're going to talk about, I'm going to speak very generally because they tend to vary state by state. Now, over time, it's actually, I think, fair to say that our topics today, like how do contracts work? What's a farm foreclosure like? They're more similar from state to state than they used to be, but they are still significantly different. And I'm going to try to emphasize this where it feels like there's a lot of difference, but you really, really need to keep in mind that I'm talking generally. And for that matter, like I'm only licensed to practice law in Minnesota, so I actually could not give you legal advice in other states, and not, probably be in trouble with a bar association if somebody cared. So we're going to talk generally about a number of these topics. So please keep that in mind. It's not super specific advice about going out and challenging something. So Roman numeral 2 here, contracts. It seems like contracts should be a super simple thing, but actually, it's more complicated than you might think sometimes. Not that this should be a judge of how complicated it is actually, but it takes law students a full semester even to understand what the basics of a contract is. And so I think we can probably handle it in 5 or 7 or 10 minutes, but still, there are details here. So parties. The parties in a contract are the two sides of the agreement. A party can be a person, a government, a business. And so a contract is an agreement between parties that is legally enforceable. And so when you boil that all down, it means that you and I have an agreement. If one of us backs out after the agreement is made or is unable or unwilling to carry out the agreement, the other of us can actually go to court and ask the court to enforce the contract, enforce the agreement. If one of us does not follow through, and it's technically, as a legal matter, generally called a default. Interestingly, there's no legal widespread definition of a default. A default is whatever your contract kind of says it is. So it's kind of one of these fuzzy terms that's important, but you don't have a universal declaration of what a default is. One of the super common questions that a lawyer will get about contracts is, should a contract be in writing? And I think actually that the answer to that question is that they should very, very often be in writing, even when we're kind of used to not having them writing, but for different reasons than we sometimes think. There are some contracts, which we'll talk about in a second, which must be in writing if you want to have them legally enforceable. But many contracts, I think, just kind of should. And the reason is that when you write something down as an agreement, you make the chance of misunderstanding much, much less. The main problem with people's commercial agreements, and this is true of farmers and actually probably true in the rest of the world as well, is and why writing really makes sense for an agreement. It's not the problem is not so much people trying to rip each other off or somebody trying to get away with something or acting in bad faith. The problem is actually much more often a misunderstanding. Two people reach an agreement, they use the same words, but they're not understanding what those words mean the same way. And you can make that as simple as you want. I'm going to give you 75 bushels of tomatoes over the summer to sell in your grocery store. And sounds completely straightforward. But then again, what's the timing? How will you be paid? How much will you be paid? You may think that the deliveries come, every month. I may think it's every week. Those are the sorts of things that it kind of makes sense to go ahead and write it down. And again, it's not that you plan to sue each other, but it just sort of helps everybody understand what's up. So, contracts are super basic, important thing. They're really commonly important for farmers. I think it's worth pointing out that we do these sort of contracts much more often than we sometimes realize. Every time that you lease land, you've actually engaged in a form of a contract, whether you wrote it down or not. Um, but there is a wide variety in contracts too, and you will sometimes hear lawyers talk about the difference between what people will call a marketing contract, and that's sort of what we just described, where I say to you, I will deliver this product to you, and it's going to be this kind of a product, and you're going to pay for it. That would be a marketing contract. A production contract is important in agriculture because you have poultry growers and hog producers that enter into a kind of a specialized type of contract that people call production contracts, which is very, very detailed about the genetics that you use, about the feed that you feed the poultry or the hogs with. I mean, really explicit details, really pretty much about how you do things every day. So on one hand, with a marketing contract, the agreement is about what I deliver to you. And with a production contract, it's about how I work every day on the farm. And so production contracts are much more problematic. I know at Flag, we wince every time we hear about somebody with a production contract and things are going wrong because frankly, they are often one-sided against the farmer and cause people lots of problems. That's my editorialization about production contracts. So that's contracts in general. Let's move on. Another thing that
Before you move on, Stephen, I do have a question about contracts. Like, what makes a contract legally enforceable? Like, is it just because we wrote something up on a piece of paper and you and I signed it, or it was notarized, or a lawyer created it? Like, what makes it a legally binding document?
super good question. And the answer is it's a legally enforceable contract if you and I intended it to be a legally enforceable contract. So it can be verbal. And actually, we sort of skipped over this part. Let's talk about the writing of a contract. So it doesn't necessarily have to be in writing in most cases. The crucial definition of a contract is an agreement. And what writing does, on one hand, is just make sure that the two of us had an agreement. When we both sign it, it sort of adds to the evidence, the proof that we intended to have an agreement. And so that's why courts like to see written contracts because it makes it easier to understand what people thought they were doing, is the theory. Now it is, and so it doesn't have to, it's not necessarily a contract if a lawyer writes it, and you don't have to necessarily have a lawyer write it to have a contract. It's lawyers in that sense can be irrelevant. Um, the part that I sort of skipped by is that in almost every state, I'll say there are certain kinds of contracts that do need to be in writing. They can be really simple, but they need to be in writing. And most often, those are things like the sale of land for real estate. And if you have an agreement to sell land, In general, across the country, that has to be in writing. Or if you have an agreement to lease land, and the lease will be greater than 1 year, or sometimes a year total, those need to be written down. And so very strange wording. Lawyers call this the statute of frauds. Do not ask me why. But the statute of frauds tells us what contracts must be in writing, and every state will have a little list. And so the most common ones involve land, which we just mentioned. Also, a promise to lend money in almost every state must be in writing. Sales of a certain amount, often the promise of a sale, often of $500 or more, but not always, must be in writing. So what happens if you do a contract, let's say to lease land for 2 years, and you don't bother to write it down? As long as there's no disagreement, it doesn't matter. Both parties go right ahead. You have a tenant, a landlord gets paid, tenant gets to farm. But if you have a sort of a breakdown or disagreement, and let's say the landlord um, boots the tenant off the land after 1 year, and you had a 2-year agreement, if the tenant tries to go to court, in most states, if the lease wasn't written down, the court will say this contract falls under the statute of frauds and is not enforceable. So I know that sounds more tricky than it should, but the basic line here is that there are certain kinds of contracts that need to be in writing, but in general, oral contracts are fine. And to follow up on Mary's question, there's no special language. They can be simple, they can be long. That's not kind of the crucial point. Does that fill in some of the blanks, Mary? Excellent.
I have a question too, Stephen. This is
Yes.
Alexandria. I was wondering if production contracts are most commonly seen in contract growing or if they're seen anywhere else in agriculture.
I think that they're very rare, except with raising poultry, um, for food, to be eaten, not for eggs, but to be eaten, and with hogs. And it may have crept into other areas, but if so, I'm not familiar. I mean, so I can easily imagine what would be a good example. Well, turkeys. You could do turkeys. There could be other birds, but that's all still poultry. I don't know if somebody knows of like goats being raised on contract, it wouldn't shock me, but I've never heard of it. But so I think the short answer, Alexandra, is it's really with animals, and it's with animals where the buyer has a very specific product in mind. Like they want these animals to be a certain size, to be fed a certain thing. So they really want to control what the farmer does. And thus they write a contract that spells that out.
We've run into a few contract grazing situations, but they don't usually have like production outcomes as much as more just like it's almost more like a land lease to a certain extent with a manager built in. But I don't know if you've seen as much of that, Stephen.
And was this with generally like beef cattle grazing
Yeah, it's
or?
usually beef, sometimes dry heifers.
Yeah, I think of that as as more of just a lease, but you could ride it. I mean, and frankly, the production and contracts and marketing contracts, there's no firm definition of the two. It's not like they get treated in a special way just by that label. So my guess is that what you have is a lease with specific terms about what somebody can do on the land during the lease. You can graze, but you can't plow it up and things like that. That would be my guess, as to what's going on there. Does that make sense?
Thank you,
Yes, thank you.
Stephen.
Yeah.
I
Right.
also someone said in the chat that also maybe organic vegetable distributors might have a production contract with a grower, and that just so you know, it's in the chat.
Interesting. I can imagine that. I've never seen an organic contract that I thought came that close to a production contract, in part because you have so many specific things that you need to do to be certified organic. And so if your marketing contract says this needs to be a certified organic product, then that would be, most common. But if you go further and say, oh, and it's going to be organic milk, and you're going to feed hay from this place, and the buyer, I'm going to deliver the hay to you that you're going to use. And if you use grain, it's going to be my grain. And I mean, that gets you much closer to a production contract. All right, so let's talk just for a second about the types of property. And this is going to be really obvious to some people, but it's actually quite important and I think worth mentioning. So there are a number of kinds of property. We're only going to talk about two. So real property or real estate is, first of all, land, and it's also anything that's permanently connected to the land. And so real estate and real property are sort of used synonymously. So a building is real property. There are a few things that kind of straddle the line, and you get these obscure court cases trying to decide whether something is real property or not, or gets treated as real property. For example, some silos have been sort of ruled to be not permanent enough to be treated as real property. But in most cases, you're talking about things that are really very firmly connected to the land. Personal property in a farm world is pretty much everything else. So your equipment, your machinery, your crops, all those are personal property. And that the reason that this even matters is coming up next. Debtor-creditor law. Because of the sort of nature of nature, right? That things take a while to grow and develop. I'm not telling you anything you guys don't know, but farms are sort of many farms are locked into borrowing money for their inputs, working like the devil, and then only having a crop or something to sell later. And so inevitably, there are people that can't just pay for everything up front, so they borrow. And so we have this whole system of cycles of borrowing for inputs and other things. We also have people, unless they are lucky enough to inherit a farm, I guess, buying land one way or another. And so we have loans that, where you borrow to buy land. And where this all becomes important is that the terms of the loans and the way that they get enforced really are different based on the collateral in question. And the collateral is, again, just to say, just so we're all super clear, I lend Mary money, and the agreement I have with Mary is that if she doesn't pay me back, I'm going to come and take her tractor to make sure I get my money. So when we do that agreement, Mary's personal property, her tractor, has been collateral for her loan. And it's easy to think of real estate loans going the same way. Now, we often associate correctly, actually, that the collateral is often what the loan was for. Like I gave Mary money so she could buy that tractor. And therefore, I want to be able to snatch the tractor back as a lender in order to pay for the loan if Mary can't pay it. So, again, it sounds super basic, but it gets tricky in a hurry. One of the things that will happen when people get loans is they're going to offer collateral for their loan. Not in every loan, but in a lot of them. And I think if there's just two or three things I would ask you to take away from our talk today. One is that when farmers borrow money, it is essential, absolutely essential, to understand the collateral for the loan. and to know when that can change and know what it means. And like if you have cattle as collateral, you can't just sell them unless the proceeds go directly to the creditor, to the lender. There's when something is collateral, it really means a lot. So it's quite important to know your collateral, because if you think about it, if you've already offered all of your land as collateral for a loan, lenders are not going to be as anxious to make an additional loan to you if they have to be second and behind somebody else, when you try to use that land as collateral. So it's a very important step to offer collateral. It's important to understand what the collateral is and what the rights are of the creditor or the lender, whenever that loan is made. So you can divide up loans that farmers and a lot of other people use too, I think, in three really general categories. And here we have them: B, C, and D. B is what you might call unsecured debt. The classic example of that is a credit card. And if you haven't spent very much time working with farmers, if you've never run across somebody who is farming on a credit card, don't pretend it doesn't happen. It's can be a disastrous thing, but people people are doing their best, right? And so there is actually a lot of unsecured debt out there that farmers have. So you're also anytime a farmer borrows money but does not offer collateral for that very loan, that is unsecured debt. Lots and lots of unsecured debt out there. And the crucial thing here is, if you think about it, if there's no easy way for the lender to collect on that debt by seizing collateral, the obvious thing that a lender does is that the rest of the terms aren't as favorable. So what's your highest interest rate loan? It's unsecured debts. And it is possible that your lender can collect on this debt eventually, even if you don't want to pay, but they have to sue you. And they go to court and they get a judgment, and then you have a judgment, and the courts will permit the lender, the creditor, to take some of your property as a result of that judgment. So that's unsecured debt. Everybody hanging in so far? Questions? Okay. So the next form of, I think, is a way to think about this, is debt secured by personal property. So in the farm world, we're talking about inputs, and all the loans that you have to buy equipment or fertilizer, whatever. And in general, those are all secured by some form of personal property. So if a loan for seed is almost always going to have as collateral the crop that comes from that seed. And crops, in a sort of question that would be obscure for most people, including most lawyers, is important in agriculture, which is, what is a crop? Is it real estate or personal property? And the answer in almost all instances, it's actually personal property, although it can be tricky in some ways. And definitely a crop that's harvested is personal property. So there's a system in every state they're roughly similar, but they have differences. The Uniform Commercial Code is what it's called. And that sort of sets out how collateral is used with personal property. There's a set of rules. The short answer to the question here is, what happens if you can't pay? Is that this is where your lender or your creditor comes and takes your tractor, has the right to come and take your property that serves as collateral. Now, it'd be nice if I could spell here. I thought I spell checked this. Okay, sorry. Under C, breach. That word is breach. It needs an A. Creditors may not breach the peace. They can't knock your door down and break your locks to get the collateral from their loan. But they can come and take things, and don't think they won't, right? And so that's collateral for personal property when you default on the loan.
Stephen,
Yes,
there's a question in the chat from Meg Moynihan.
Meg Moynihan.
Are you ready?
I thought Meg knew everything already. Okay.
Hello.
Maybe she's
No, I
asking.
just act that way. I just act that way.
What is
How you
Meg's
doing?
question, Alexandra?
It might be for Farm Law 201, but it's about buyers who welch on contracts with farmers. So not the farmer who owes, but the buyer who owes. And I'm thinking about, we've had several big grain buyers in the last few years who have gone belly up. And many farmers' minds were blown when they found out they legally had to deliver grain they were contracted to deliver, even though they knew they wouldn't get paid for it.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the one way that I would change your question is it probably was still technically possible for the farmer to get paid. But common sense says you're in trouble. But yeah, I mean, there is a way, this would be Farm Law 2 or 3 or 401. I mean, you
Sorry.
can, it's called anticipatory breach. I mean, if it's super clear that the other party is not going to be able to carry out their part of the bargain, it's possible to break the contract yourself. And I mean, people in those instances, I hope they were, if the stakes were high, I hope they got a lawyer, because you know, if the buyer really does go bust or files a bankruptcy petition, the seller is going to have certain legal rights, which they're really going to depend on the facts.
Yeah.
But if it's just kind of your intuition, oh, this buyer doesn't look good, I'm worried, you're a little bit stuck. I mean, you need a pretty good reason not to break the contract.
Okay, well, I don't want to belabor this, but maybe, we can think down the road about doing some producer education so people are more familiar with what their rights are in those situations. Because I don't think we're at the end of that.
Yeah, no, agreed. And actually, there's a fair bit to be said about bankruptcy when the farmer is the one that money is owed to. I mean, it happens more than you might think, and I think that's sort of what you're describing here.
Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah. So, yeah. My email is where is my email? I hope you can print this if you want to.
I could put your email in the chat, Steve.
Thank you very much, Mary. But please follow up, send me an email. I think it's something that Flag could work on to be able to describe people's rights for that. And certainly not to get too Minnesota specific, Meg, but certainly from Minnesota.
I love hearing that.
Good.
Make Scott Carlson do it.
The one bright piece of news. No. As you'll notice, almost all this talk is about, gee, what could possibly go wrong and what does it mean? It's definitely a Debbie Downer sort of presentation. So, where are we? Real estate loans. There are two different main types of ways that people use credit to get a hold of land. One is mortgages, and we're quite familiar with those. It's very similar to, what happens when people buy a house. And in a mortgage, there are three parties. There's we'll say just say farmer. So the farmer is borrowing money from a bank or other lending institution, using that money to pay the seller. And then from every day past the sale, the economic relationship is between the farmer and the lender. The seller is out of the picture, and you're offering the land almost always as the collateral. So if you default on your mortgage, you remember default is when you seem to be breaking the contract. The remedy, and this is the legal term, the remedy for the lender is to foreclose on the mortgage and take the property back, take the property. So the other sort of avenue, which is interestingly fairly common in agriculture, is contracts for deed. In a contract for deed, and sometimes these are called installment loans or installment sales. It depends on what state you're in. But the basic theory of a contract for deed is that we'll stick with Mary as the person who keeps getting in business relationships with me and regrets it. So I sell Mary a piece of land. She and I have a contract for deed. And what that says is that Mary pays for the land to me over time. And so while technically Mary doesn't own the land during all those payments, and they're often, I mean, we're talking normally about 30 years of payments, just like a mortgage. Mary gets to use the land in pretty much any way she wants to, with a few exceptions, but let's just say she's farming, so she farms. And after she pays me these 30 years of payments, she gets the official title of the land. She gets to use it, but she doesn't officially own it. The tricky part of a contract for deed or installment sale is that, let's say Mary pays me 15 years, is halfway through, and then has problems making the payments. In almost every state, it's going to be possible for me to take back the land, and Mary can, if everything goes badly, lose all the money she already paid to me. And this is, I mean, this can happen. Now, in the last few decades, you've had state legislatures changing some of these contract for deed laws, but don't ignore the possibility here that Mary could lose all the money she paid to me. Now, if you're assisting somebody or this is you in this position, the short best answer is someone in Mary's position gets a mortgage or some other loan to pay off the last half of the contract for deed, then it's hers. And that way she doesn't lose her original payments. But when you read a contract for deed, boy, I mean, it's grim. I mean, the possibilities are grim here. And especially if somebody gets hurt or ill, you have to be extremely careful to follow all the specific rules to make sure you don't lose all the payments that you have made on a contract for deed.
Stephen,
Yes.
there is a question from Margaret.
Margaret.
She says, is this the kind of purchase that FSA's land contract guarantee program was designed to make less risky for the seller?
I would have thought the answer is no, but I'm not for sure. I mean, okay, let's put it this way. FSA rules, to my knowledge, do not contemplate using contracts for deed. They're all mortgages. Now, the specific program you're talking about, Margaret, may well be a way to help people who already have contracts for deed. We can follow up. The short answer is I don't know, but we can look it up. Is that?
Absolutely. Yeah, we can follow up. It was a curious question more so than a need to know in this very moment.
You know where to find me. So I won't escape the question permanently. I have a feeling. All right. So if a Roman numeral E, it's easy to say this, but hard to do. If you're in a position or someone you're working with is in a position where they have a loan and they can't make the payments or they default or they treat the collateral improperly, or there's a whole list of things that can go wrong. You do have legal rights. You always have legal rights. The process may be sort of weighted against you unless you can sort of get it upright with the payments and stop whatever it was that causing the default. But here's the big problem is that people don't understand they have rights, and it just becomes overwhelming. And so this is something that I've said to farmers, for a long time. And I think it's a crucial thing. When people are in debtor-creditor relationships and things go bad, it is never, ever, ever, ever the right answer to ignore it and hope it goes away, or to just be unable to summon facing it. I mean, it's like harsh to say, but you gotta You got to open the mail. You got to respond to these things. Even if the ultimate result is not good, your rights and your chance to save your part of your operation or whatever is left, frankly, of your wealth, it's always better to deal with it. And maybe that can mean getting, working with an advocate or a lawyer, or even just showing up at proceedings. It's always better to be there and to get after it in a way. There are more resources now available than there used to be, so use them. We're not going to talk a lot about bankruptcy here. There are special forms of bankruptcy, as most of you know, that are for farmers. I think when I think of bankruptcy in sort of these general situations, I really think of bankruptcy as something in the background that's one of the few things that the farmer has as a power for a negotiation. And it's expensive to foreclose on people, and it's a pain. Um, and if you can do, if you have power here to shut everything down, to work through a bankruptcy and maybe get debt written off or written down. It's not always going to work that way, but it's one of the powers that you do have. I just have one sentence here that's more loaded than it may seem. The best candidates for bankruptcy are people who have unsecured credit. Remember, we described unsecured credit as that where there's no collateral, or undersecured credit, which is to say your loan is for 100 and the collateral for the loan is only worth 70. That's undersecured credit. I mean, I'm summarizing hundreds of pages of law here into one sentence. Those are the two best scenarios for using bankruptcy to your advantage. I am really not a person who will say at the drop of a hat, get a lawyer, but I will say it is hard for me to think of people who've on their own done bankruptcies where it turned out super well. I think you really, really need to get some help. And at least an advocate to sort of help you with all the numbers, but actually the legal part of it is so easy to screw up. And ideally, if you are going to do a bankruptcy, plan it. And that is to say, get your bankruptcy lawyer involved earlier, not later. I mean, it's true. You can stop a foreclosure hours before the foreclosure with a bankruptcy, but it is so much to your advantage to do it earlier. And further, I'll say again, get a lawyer, because if you start manipulating who you pay and who you don't pay and then do a bankruptcy petition, you can screw yourself up badly. It is, you can plan a bankruptcy, but you can also get it wrong. And, remember, you're in federal court. You start screwing things up, it's serious business. The last thing to be said following that is always, always be truthful in bankruptcy proceedings. People who've done farm law can tell you stories. I mean, I even remember the people's names after all these years. A guy did like totally nothing wrong, really. I mean, he what's called converted collateral. He took his hogs, which were collateral, and he sold them, and he used it to pay other creditors and to partially feed the family. And it's against the law. And it's actually, in some cases can be criminal conversion of collateral. And this farmer lied about it in bankruptcy court. And he went to prison because the lender just wouldn't let go. And yeah, I don't know what to say. It's like, the truth is generally a good thing. As a lawyer, I'm going to encourage you to be honest in all of your dealings, but let's just never, ever, ever play games in a bankruptcy court. All right, on that happy note, Farm Service Agency and Farm Credit System, we talked about this whole world of loans. And Farm Service Agency and the Farm Credit System have specific and different rules, and it's worth checking those out if you aren't familiar with them already. So let's take a breath before we move on. We're what, 50 minutes through? We're about to move to legal liability. Does anybody have something that they want to hear about or discuss before we do that? All right, let's go. Legal liability, another cheerful topic. It's super possible if a farmer to get sued. Now, we can all get sued for all kinds of things, but farmers have good reason to be pretty nervous about the legal liability they have in certain areas. So lawyers, of course, have names for all of this. The first form you can see here under Roman numeral 6A is premises liability. Premises liability is somebody is on your farm and they fall into a well and hurt themselves, or they stepped on a hoe because you had a you picket day, or anything where somebody comes on your property and gets hurt. They have a decent shot at suing you. And so I'm being kind of cute here, but yeah, this is true in most places. I mean, you can overgeneralize, but in most places, even trespassers can sue you. And nobody wants to hear that, and it sucks, I guess, but it's reality. And to the extent that you invite people on your farm for business reasons, and somebody gets hurt, your legal liability can be very significant. And I think people are pretty much aware of this. I mean, you don't have the sort of hay rides that you used to have, and you have people trying to be more careful about stuff because, again, this is not what you really want to emphasize talking to farmers, but let's all admit that farms are dangerous places. It is really easy to get hurt. It's easy for you to get hurt. It's easy for visitors to get hurt. It's easy to get hurt. You don't have to walk into a bull lot with a Holstein bull to get hurt on the farm, although that's a good way to do it. There are when you have livestock, you have all buildings. I mean, it's just sort of endless the way that you can get hurt on a farm. And the reality is when that happens, you can get sued. And that lawyers call that premises liability. For a very long time, farmers didn't really have to worry about the safety of what they sold. It was just a sort of raw commodity. And even now, right? I mean, you sell soybeans, what is it? A third of it's going to end up in China feeding hogs. Like you don't have any real liability for that product. But to the extent that you do direct marketing or in any way sort of on-farm processing and selling, again, let's face just for a moment the realities, which are thousands and thousands of people get foodborne illness every year. It's not just from farmers markets or anything like that. It's just a reality. And if you sell food to somebody and they get sick and they can show that it was due to what you sold them, they can sue you. And it sounds sort of a little bit bizarre and unfair, but just think for a second from the other side. Let's say you did your best, you sold somebody something off your farm, and it made a little kid really sick. I mean, you did your best, but things happen, right? And so those folks can sue you. The third one that we mentioned here is debtor-creditor stuff, and that's when we just discussed above, like you owe somebody money, so they sue you. And there are lots of others. I mean, it's a nation of lawyers and litigation, and so everybody can get sued for anything. We're not even going to talk about pesticide drift and a lot of the other lawsuits that a farmer can be subjected to. Here's the question is what is the best way to manage this risk as a farmer?
Before you continue, Stephen, there's one question kind of going back to the premises liability.
Yes.
Laura said in the chat, we do a lot of farm visits and want to make sure hosts are protected. Our own liability waivers just cover us / our training program, but not that host. I'm curious if there's any standard language or a template you would recommend. We have modified ours with some basic language for them to use for their own business.
Okay, I think I'm tracking, parties A, B, and C here. I mean, just to jump to the answer that I have is everybody should have insurance. Like I mean, everybody should do their best to make sure no one gets hurt. and everybody should have insurance. Those are the two. I mean, I'm not saying don't do anything else, but everybody in this sort of interlocking chain of responsibility should have insurance. And as I'm going to say in a minute, it's just not that expensive. I mean, please just do it.
But if they don't, would a liability waiver cover them or not?
So the liability waiver is somebody who walks on the farm and you ask them to sign something that says, I won't
Yes.
sue you.
Yes.
Okay, so we're in the land now of 50 different states with, plus whatever else and state laws. I'm going to say I would not run my farm like that, like where that's the only protection. I would also get insurance. I'm not saying don't do it. I'm not saying it wouldn't help. I am saying it scares me to rely just on that because the rest of the facts will matter a lot. I mean, it's going to be more helpful if it's something that a reasonable person would anticipate as a possible risk. It's going to be less helpful if it's not. I mean, you can just imagine, legally, it's actually more complicated than you might think. And the good thing about insurance is, as long as you do whatever your policy says that you're going to do, they have to help you. So again, I hope this is not bad news. I mean, I don't know who wrote the waiver. If waivers are not ironclad, and the worse that happens, the more danger you're in that the waiver doesn't work.
And so
Right.
if they do have liability insurance, can we assume that general liability insurance would cover any kind of on-premise visitor issue, or we need to check the language because they might not?
You should not assume. There are for many, many years, there have been standard farm liability policies which protected people with farms, and somebody walks on and something happens. So you definitely want one of those. And you also want to make sure that the insurance company, whoever writes the policy, knows exactly what you're doing. So don't pretend that you have a corn and bean farm and are just selling grain when you're actually doing farm visits with a farm maze and selling vegetables out of the front yard. It's just not worth it. Be really, read your policy. I know it's easy to say and hard to do, but you understand your policy and be very, very upfront with the insurance company about what you're doing. Because the reality is that the insurance is just not that expensive. They've got a lot of, that's their game, right? They have a lot of policies and they make their money a little bit at a time. And so they understand what can happen, and they understand how rare it is that people actually get sued, say, with a farm business. So if you just make it clear what you're doing, you should have a very reasonable policy that covers you, that specifically talks about farms and what you're doing is my take. And I know that is not what everybody wants to hear, but
Okay, thank you.
I feel really convinced about this one.
Thanks, that's super helpful.
All right, so what that it's a very good question because we're actually going to talk about some of that in a minute as well. We're going to do a little bit of diversion here. Roman numeral 7. We've got about half an hour. I think we're doing okay. About entities. And so when we say entities, we mean legal entities, corporations, LLCs, etc. And a lot of people, especially people starting out, feel like they just absolutely have to have an entity if they're going to farm. And for all kinds of reasons. And I've got kind of no opinion about whether somebody creates an entity or not. I mean, for some people, it's like just having a cool name, it seems to me. I think, makes more sense in that regard if you're doing direct marketing. But it's worth pointing out that most farms in America are not legal entities. there's no paperwork filed with anybody. There's nothing that says you have to file as a farmer, not USDA, not the state, not anybody. You can just farm. People have a lot of different reasons for creating entities. A lot of them make sense. I think overall, almost any lawyer who does these sorts of creation of entities would agree that if you're pretty modestly sized, it's not going to make a big difference in your ability to earn an income, whether or not you're an entity or not. When you get to super large operations, yeah, you can kind of see the way assets can get moved around and protected, that maybe there's an advantage there. You can imagine, for estate planning, maybe it makes sense to have a trust or an entity. All that is fine. But what I really want to point out here is that if you go to a lawyer and say, oh, I think I want to create an entity for my farm, lawyers will say, often quite directly, or imply that this will help you significantly with the legal problems that we just described. Premises liability, you sold food and someone got sick. And my point here is that I'm not going to say that's wrong. I think if you do create an entity, it can create a layer of protection, especially in some cases, but I just would not trust it as the sole answer. To me, the main answer here is insurance. So if you do a legal entity to protect your liability, please also get insurance. And it's, I think, worth just explaining a little bit about the logic of that. So when you create an entity, what you're saying is basically the entity is farming, not you, or vice versa, or the entity has all of your other assets, something like that. You're saying there are two people here in a legal sense. One of them is you and one of them is the entity. And the idea regarding protecting yourself from legal liability is that if somebody gets hurt on the farm, they can sue the entity, but they can't sue you because they were on the entity's property, let's say. And it is plausible. This is not a crazy idea. I mean, it is true that they would, any lawyer would sue the entity, but the reality is they would also sue you. And the problems will become very serious when the lawyer attempts to what is known as, let's skip down. Did I use the term or not? I guess I didn't. It's called piercing the corporate veil. It's, again, one of these sort of strange legal terms. Basically, what happens when someone sued you and your business, and you say, no, it's really my business that did this, not me. The business doesn't have many assets, so good luck. What piercing the corporate veil means is that the lawyer for the person who was hurt, if they were hurt, is going to say, well, you may say that you're separate from this entity, but really you're so closely entwined that we should not respect you as two different legal entities. And it's surprisingly easy to actually make simple mistakes that make that not too hard to prove. For example, you have a business account for the farm. Let's say you pay a car payment that's not really a farm piece of equipment with your checking account for the farm business. You pay groceries with it. You're beginning to intermingle assets. Or out of your own personal account, you buy grain or you pay the veterinarian. You're again, you are intermixing yourself with your entity. And once you start doing that, if a push comes to shove, a court is very likely to say, you may have created this entity, but you're not adequately separate to insulate yourself from legal liability for the entity. Now, the piercing the corporate veil doesn't happen all that often, but I think the reason for that is that it's not all that often a point of contention. And this is what I mean. When are you most going to need the protection of something like this for your farm? It's going to be when things are very serious. Somebody has actually really, really gotten hurt, and the liability could be large. That's exactly the moment you need the protection the most. And that's also exactly the moment when a lawyer suing you is going to start digging through your records to try to pierce the corporate veil. So things go on for years and everything works perfectly well. Well, yeah, I guess the entity worked, but the entity never got challenged. It's when you most desperately need the entity to protect you that it's at its weakest. And again, I'm not offering a contradiction to any lawyer who says, I really recommend you do an entity to protect on your legal risk. I'm not saying it's no help. I'm saying I very strongly think you also need to get insurance. Any questions so far? Well, I'm going to talk about insurance for a second. Ideas? Okay. What the heck is insurance? I mean, it's not the sort of thing you usually just sort of sit and think about. But you're buying really two things. You're buying that the insurance company fights the lawsuit, which otherwise you have to do all yourself. You have to hire a lawyer. You got to pay them. It's a headache. Also, the insurance company will pay if the party has a good claim. And so I'm not saying I would be the last person to really be a big defender of insurance companies, actually. And if they try to screw you over in most states, they can get in really big trouble if they act in bad faith. But that's what you're paying for. You're paying for them to fight it, and you're paying for them to pay a significant amount if something did go wrong. You mentioned C here, federal crop insurance. It's just like the names are so similar. I think it's worth pointing out that federal crop insurance is a completely different system. It's really not about the sort of premises liability or foodborne illness that's at stake. It's about your crops and whether they fail or not. And it would be a whole nother day of a topic to talk about crop insurance. One of the things that I think is worth emphasizing to people who say do direct marketing or have a lot of diversified farm operations, crop insurance is not meant for you. It was not designed for you, but it is worth still checking it out. I mean, when I say not meant, I just mean, it's the most common crop insurance policies are for big commodity producers. Yes, you can in many cases get crop insurance even with a diversified farm and even if you're direct marketing. It's just harder and it's more complicated. But I really strongly recommend that people investigate crop insurance as a risk management tool, even if it doesn't seem super convenient or applicable. And this is not what insurance people say. It's not what USDA wants you to say. But the reality is that for your federal crop insurance payment that, where you buy the insurance, you're paying way less than half of what the crop insurance actually costs. Most of the cost of crop insurance is borne by the federal government. And so if you have a way to sort of fit into that system, the system is built to more than protect you. It's built really, honestly, to be a form of a subsidy. And for 25 or 30 years in a row, the federal crop insurance system has paid out more than farmers paid in. I mean, it's just the reality. And I'll say again, it's not what you hear the Secretary of Agriculture say in describing crop insurance. But if you're a farmer and you just assume it's not for you, I would suggest checking it out. All
Stephen,
right.
there's a question
Yes.
about crop insurance. Well, not crop insurance, actually. For a farmer that is an entity, should the individual or the company buy insurance or both? Back to the previous insurance
I think the
topic.
same policy can indemnify everybody. I mean, I would talk to who's writing it. I would want to make sure that the policy covers both. And if not, then ask why. And I mean, you're talking about the same assets. I mean, Yeah, I'll stick with that. I'll just say you would like to see them indemnify both. All right, we're down to less time than I would have hoped. I'm just going to say very briefly, Roman numeral 9, once you start hiring people, the ball game completely changes. Again, it's sometimes surprising to people that most farms don't hire employees. And many farms that do not hire very many. And so I'm gonna apologize again. You know, I felt for sure I spell checked this, but my God, look at these typos. Okay. When you start hiring somebody, you have entered a world where you need to do a lot more investigation about your responsibilities. Those responsibilities in some ways are part of federal law. In other ways, they're state to state. And so there are some good resources out there to help guide you. You know, I've looked at a few of the states, and every state I look at, there are good materials about when you need to worry about workers' compensation. To what extent does a farm exempt? I mean, in some of these you'll see under C, this is just the beginning. I mean, there are other things too, but just think about it for a second. If you really are going to have employees, you need to know whether you have to pay into workers' compensation. You need to know whether you need to pay into unemployment insurance. You need to know how minimum wage laws affect you. You're going to have to do payroll. Think about payroll taxes. If you think you have a contractor, not an employee, you need to be sure. And if you if you do have a contractor, they need to get a 1099. You can't, you got to follow the rules. And I'm not saying all this is super hard. But what it does make me nervous is when people do super informal hiring, and have, you know, maybe bend the rules about, you know, the sort of ways that you treat an employee. And, you know, there was a moment a few years ago where people seemed to think that the answer was to have an intern. Well, I have an intern, they stay on the farm, but we don't really pay them, but they're not really workers, they're interns. Well, what do? Oh, they work in the field, you know. Well, sorry, you know, you have an employee, probably, or you need to at least think about what the rules are for each of these things in terms of whether you have an employee. I know, again, I keep saying I've been doing this a long time, but I actually have. I know, again, I can remember the name of the family. You know, there's somebody out there in Minnesota who had a long-term person who worked with them, and there was a dairy farm, and this employee hurt his back, and they thought they were exempt from workers' compensation, but they didn't really understand the rules. And this guy was really, really hurt. And it was devastating because they came after the family, the state did. Because if you're hurt on a job, you're supposed to have a certain level of protection, and you know, source of care and whatnot. And if the state thinks that you as an employer sort of just skipped it, and then you had somebody get hurt and there's no money to help take care of them, they come after you. They're very serious about it. And again, I mean, what are the chances that's going to happen? Not super high. But the answer from, I think, a lawyer and also a common sense point of view is you just really need to find out, whether their workers' compensation is required or not. And there are tools out there to help you. And I really, really encourage people not to take the shortcut on this kind of stuff. I mean, if you end up with a lot of employees, there are requirements regarding their housing. I mean, it can be complicated. And I know it puts some people in a bind who aren't big scale operations, because, you know, it's one thing if you're like, I don't want to pick on anybody, but let's say you're growing strawberries in the Central Valley of California. Yeah, there's a lot of rules. And you also have hundreds, somebody has hundreds of employees or they're contractors or something, right? And so figure out the rules, apply them to a lot of people. But if you're like a smaller scale person with a specialty crop operation, you may well have seasonal labor, and it's going to be a hassle to figure it out. But I think that my suggestion is that you really work hard to make sure you understand your responsibilities once you hire people. All right. Roman numeral 10 is about discrimination, and I think it's really just important to add that as a farmer out there, there are lots of ways in which people can treat you differently based on your race, sex, national origin, etc. And that sort of discrimination is illegal. And I know that we're in a period now where there's a lot of flux into what is discrimination. And I mean, I'd be happy to talk about, our view, Flag's work in this area, but I will just tell you that the discrimination is not just wrong, it's illegal. And so, for example, if you're getting a loan and you're being treated differently based on your race or your gender, that's illegal. And yeah, Flag, we'd be interested to hear about it. I'm not saying we could represent you necessarily, but we could help you understand probably what the legal aspects of it are, and hopefully point you in a good direction. The last thing that I want to say, which is going to sound a little bit like 8th grade social studies class would have been what I had, is about government regulation. And to a pretty confusing extent, there is a lot of different types of government in the US. And what can be confusing is figuring out who is actually doing what. And if you're farming, you are dealing with the federal government, be it USDA, if you participate in those programs, and people, if there are people, for example, it's very easy to think, oh, if I'm going to register my farm, my name of my business, is that the same thing as getting a farm number with the USDA? And the answer is no. And part of the answer to that question is when you're registering a business, you're almost for sure doing it with the state. When you get a farm number, you're dealing with the federal government, USDA. Your farm number, you don't need that just to farm. You can farm without a farm number. You need it if you want to participate in USDA programs. And the farm number goes with the land. It's not with you. Um, and that's like just one example of sort of the way that you think, well, I need to sign up. Sign up with who? For what? I mean, it gets confusing. And I suggest that if people don't, if you're dealing with a government, it's very simple to say. And again, it's harder to understand than it seems at first. One of the first things is to figure out who it is you're dealing with. So if you have a zoning question, um, that's a local government. It's going to be the county or the city. It's not the state. It's not USDA. Or let's say you have safety regulations for selling food at a farmer's market. Well, that could be the state. It could be the county. What are the licensing rules? But it's probably not USDA. If you're trying to participate in farm programs or get disaster assistance, that is USDA. So I'm not trying to make it more complicated than it sounds. I guess what I want to emphasize is that if you think that the sort of various layers of government is confusing, that's because it is. And before sort of storming ahead, trying to negotiate all that, it's worth getting some help from somebody who has experience in dealing with these sort of different levels of government and trying to understand how to go forward. So by my clock in the outline with all of its typos, we have about 10 minutes. Is that correct, Mary? And I'm at the end here. I am going to take down the share. And 43 chats, yikes. What are some questions that people might have that would, what's up?
I have a question about, also thanks, Stephen, that was great. Are there tax implications to creating an entity?
I think the short answer is yes, although if you have a smaller operation, for the vast majority of people, what happens is they do a Schedule F, and one way or another, the profit or loss, so we're talking about federal income tax, one way or another, the profit or loss on the farm comes back to your own individual taxes. So you end up with a spot on your own individual tax form, which represents the profit or loss from the partnership, from whatever you're doing. Now you get to certain kinds of entities and it gets more complicated than that. And there are other aspects of taxes. There are estate taxes. There are all sorts of things. But I think what I said before, which I would stick to now, is if you have a modestly sized farm, the differences in income tax based on whether you have an entity are very likely to be minimal. You get a much larger operation, things get more complicated, there's more chance to, I guess, manipulate is a pejorative word, but manipulate the system. So that would be my thought is not in most cases not a huge amount until you get up to a certain scale of operation. But like in the end, the federal government is smart enough to understand, or not smart enough, but like if you have an entity which makes or loses money, they're going to try to trace it back to a person. And it takes a pretty big, complicated set of entities for that trail not to reach back to you. And for an everyday farmer, it really generally will, one way or the other.
I don't know if this is a legal question, but maybe others have run into this. It seems like for some state grants in particular, they really want to see an applicant have a Schedule F. I don't know if others run into that, but that's like just one of those things out of the gate. That's a little different than entity, but I think sometimes people move in that direction. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, Stephen, just accessing either state or federal funds and those implications.
Yeah, I think that in my experience, not to overgeneralize, farmers hate paying taxes and they especially hate a Schedule F doing it and its results. But the reality is, as you just said, more and more, I think, over time for grants, whatever, and not just the federal government, but state and other governments, to sort of prove that you're actually farming and how much farming you're doing, they want to see a Schedule F. And for everybody, for people who are not, familiar, the schedule, I should have said this in the very beginning, F is for farm. And so for your federal income taxes, it's what you do to list all your farm income, all your farm expenses, and you come out with a profit or loss. And people, I mean, we're not naive here. We know that people may not be 100% accurate on their Schedule F about their farm revenue. And so then when they're asked to produce a Schedule F to sort of show that they're, this or that, they're sort of chagrined because they feel like it's not as, it doesn't capture all their farm operation. And, there's kind of nothing to say except that, well, this is what you filed. And so I think I think your point is exactly the right one, which is everybody should have a heads up. The Schedule F is more than just your income tax. It's going to be your documentation for participation in public programs in many, many cases. And there's really just no way around it. If you want an FSA loan and you've been farming, you got to have your Schedule F. It's they're not mistreating you. It's what it's like that's the rule. They're not mistreating you in a way they don't mistreat everybody else. Like they make everybody do it. I hope that helps answer your question.
I have a question. I'm calling from in here from Hawaii, and we have a hard time finding lawyers who really specialize in farm and agriculture issues. I'm just curious if you have supported cases from here, from there, or if you would have a network of local people that you would direct us to, connect us to.
I know one person in Hawaii that does farm law, and she's sort of retired. Um, I mean, actually, it's hard to find farm lawyers everywhere, not just in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. It's hard to find them everywhere. And it's really, for some things, quite important to have somebody who has a familiarity with agriculture. In other things, not so. You know, if you're doing an estate plan or something like that, your everyday lawyer is just kind of got to be adequate. And I know in Hawaii, you guys have, you know, what the rest of the 48, 49 states thinks is just a bizarre system of deeds for real estate, which I couldn't even begin to understand. So that's another layer of complication for land access, I know. But I'm afraid, you know, for like real estate issues, you just got to kind of go with somebody who does real estate. And for, I mean, yeah, so Farm Aid is on the call. Farm Aid, do you have any good referrals for anybody in Hawaii? Do you think?
Not off the top of my head. I think Go Farm Hawaii is one of our referrals, unfortunately. If they don't know, I don't.
Yeah, I mean, it's a bummer. And we're all just doing the best we can. I mean, there are just so few lawyers that want to do it. And the lawyers that do it want to charge a lot of money. I mean, in general. And so their clients tend to be very large farm operations.
I
I mean,
threw
I know you
this.
guys
Oh,
don't
sorry.
have any more big sugar plantations anymore, but I know you got something that are big operations. And you know those folks have lawyers. It's just they're paying them a lot of money. And so for the folks that I have no doubt you work with, that's just that's not an option. So
Yeah. We're
I wish I
connected
had a
to,
better answer.
there's an agriculture mediation program, which I believe is national. Then they have one person in Hawaii who sometimes responds to emails. And yeah, otherwise
Well,
it's,
that's not acceptable, actually.
well,
Mm, yeah.
thank you.
And I threw in the chat, we've got a model in New England where there's a nonprofit that actually coordinates with a lot of larger law firms throughout the area to provide, like, basically channel their pro bono services to farmer needs. And they've been an amazing partner. I don't know if that could be replicated overnight, but definitely as a model I've seen have some success in our region.
Go Legal Food Hub. Yeah. No, that I think it's just fabulous. I mean, part of I think what you bump into though is that New England has a lot of, as my dad would have called me, do-gooder lawyers that work in Boston and other places.
Definitely, definitely.
And, you know, if you get out in like Western Nebraska, you know, the farm lawyers aren't getting rich. I mean, they're doing fine. But to ask them to start taking on clients for free, I think they should, but it's tougher. You know, it's different than having a junior associate in a Boston law firm who's already making $500,000 saying, "Hey, let's help some urban farmers." You know, I mean, it's just a different kind of a world, I would say. But I think pro bono work through firms and through networks is an important piece of whatever answer we can come up with here. And I've been exposed to Legal Food Hub folks, and you've got a lot of resources in New England, which everyone else is envious of. The Vermont Law School clinical program. I mean, just a lot going on. So good for you. But it's just not there for everybody.
Makes sense.
Anybody else? I think we're remarkably right on time. Jose Ernesto, you don't have a question. I thought you were going to try to stump me with something, which I know you could do if you tried, but you don't have to, but feel free to go ahead. Anyone else? Mary, are we back to you?
I think so. Yeah, if no one has any last minute questions. Yeah, thank you so much, Stephen. This has been awesome. We really appreciate yeah, just like all the words of wisdom and the insight that you shared. I think folks were really excited about this, and yeah, we were messaging in the chat that we need to make sure everybody watches this video. So we really appreciate it, and this is really good information. We appreciate it.
That's great. The one thing that I wanted to add, I meant to say this in the beginning, is that something like this we've done before, but what we at Flag have yet to do is really write this up in a way that we would feel super good about distributing, and it's sort of getting this balance where federal law, general state law, you know, you want to be as specific as you can, but without like beginning to make mistakes. And I think that we're headed down the road of having a better set of materials, you know, that's sort of like what this outline is, except maybe 4 or 5 times more detailed. So I think, be it through Pilot or other means, the Pilot Network, I think we're getting closer to having better materials on this. So hopefully, I think that would be something that people could use.
Yeah, that's great. And yeah, I'm happy that we can use the Pilot Network and the DBAN network generally in the future to kind of help advance that. And Ben does have one last question in the chat. Would Flag produce something that would be different than what Farm Commons puts out?
Yeah, so we know Farm Commons, and I really rely on their materials like everybody else, and they do a great job. I think there's enough to be done that we don't really overlap. We don't tend to overlap in what we write. I mean, they're one of the few places that's kind of in a similar position as Flag in terms of writing materials that are helpful to as broad a group of people as we can. And so if it's so close that you wonder why both exist, we will have made a mistake, I think is the answer to your question, Ben. It's like
Yeah, I was just more curious, yeah, more for the details, but I know we're kind of wrapping on time, but yeah, thank you for
Yeah,
that,
so I mean,
response. That makes sense why it has to be, it's a hard line to walk, I imagine.
yeah, I mean, there's lots of things to write about and not much time. And one of the first things that I do if I'm writing something is figure out what everybody else has done, because if there's something good enough already, I don't need to do it. There's plenty to do. So I would hope that the Farm Commons materials would be complementary to anything that we would do. And I feel confident that we would do that. But I admire their work, and as I say, use it myself. So it's not, the fact that we would do something does not denigrate their work at all.